Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes scored their first podium of the season just 24 hours after a classic dig from Hamilton's long-term rival Fernando Alonso. Mercedes has hit itself with some pretty stinging criticism in recent weeks, admitting it made poor development choices and needs to change its car concept. According to Alonso, Mercedes made out like it had a rubbish car, barely able to get into the top 10, when in reality it's pretty competitive and just had its best weekend of the year in Australia. So when Mercedes outpaced Aston Martin for the first time in 2023 in Melbourne and Hamilton beat Alonso to finish second, it raised a few questions. Is Alonso right? Have Mercedes' problems been overblown? And should it stick with this car concept after all? Mercedes started the season on the back foot for the second year running in F1's new ground effect era and has claimed its car concept needs significant changes. It was considerably slower than Red Bull in the first two qualifying sessions and beaten by Alonso's Aston Martin, Mercedes' engine customer, at those events as well. But George Russell, the team's top qualifier at all three races so far, was third on the grid in Saudi Arabia and only a tenth slower than Alonso. Then Mercedes had its best Saturday of the season in Australia, where Russell was second and Hamilton was third. Alonso was pipped by Hamilton by just 0.035 seconds and said he was unsurprised by Mercedes' resurgence because he reckons the team has exaggerated how bad its car is. The two-time world champion claimed Mercedes were acting like they had a car that was not good enough to get into Q3 in qualifying and that the W14 is not as bad as made out. Alonso also pointed to Mercedes' recovery from a slow start last year into being a contender for wins, even scoring a victory late on in Brazil. Alonso's comment was obviously an exaggeration. He's always been good at those, and in his latest reinvention as F1's veteran disruptor, we kinda love him for it. He couldn't resist cheekily taking the opportunity to throw a dig at a team he is unexpectedly a direct rival of this year. He almost certainly still believes he's the best driver in F1, and we can safely assume he believes he'd be getting on with a job at Mercedes with less fuss than Hamilton has, given Alonso has made plenty of comments in the past about his nemesis, including this year, which we'll come to later. Alonso was clearly keen to get this point across as he mentioned it to both TV and written media in Australia, and on one occasion he said it while stood next to Carlos Sainz, who said he agreed. So is this a valid position to take? Well, first of all, the W14 is obviously not so bad it's out of Q3, but also Mercedes never suggested it was, so we'll chalk that one up as some creative interpretation from Alonso. It's also worth noting Mercedes' start to this season is far less problematic than last year when the W13 was that bad at times. Plus, Alonso's right that if Red Bull was removed, Mercedes' start to the season would not look quite as disappointing. But it's all relative. Red Bull is the benchmark that Mercedes measures itself against, which is what triggered the self-criticism and quite vocal complaints from Hamilton about how much he has struggled. There has also clearly been some progress with the W14 already compared to that first round, which elicited the blunt and brutal initial assessment from team boss Toto Wolff. In Bahrain, Mercedes was outpaced by Red Bull, Ferrari and Aston Martin and was 0.7% off the pace. This improved very slightly in Jeddah to being 0.67% slower than Red Bull. And in Australia, Mercedes was easily the most competitive it has been so far, with the second fastest car and both drivers in the top three on the grid just 0.3% adrift. So no, the Mercedes is not as bad as the team told us at the height of its self-criticism, but that's partly because it's performing better than it was at the start of the season. The other thing to factor in when wondering if Alonso had a point when he called out Mercedes' criticism of itself is that Mercedes did not expect the performance and the results it enjoyed in Australia. Some people will roll their eyes at that given how often Mercedes talked itself down at the height of its dominance, but presumably those people still think Mercedes has been sandbagging for the past 14 months with two different cars. Its improved performance in Melbourne was not the result of a big upgrade or a magic change to the existing car that suddenly unlocked serious speed. The suggestion is it was being run in a happier setup window, partly because Mercedes understands this car better and partly because Albert Park's smooth track surface allows it. A particularly interesting remark from Russell was that Mercedes has found the car works a bit better in reality when run differently to the way its simulations suggest it should be. While that's another blow for Mercedes' virtual development tools, it seems to have enabled a bit more performance at the track. There's still a belief within Mercedes that the car is more on a knife edge than the Red Bull and the Aston Martin, and edgy to drive as a result, so the days it's in a better window will make a big difference. There were more Melbourne-specific factors too though. Mercedes seemed to have a good grasp on the tyre warm-up demands of last weekend, something that's always a priority at Albert Park. And this, mixed with some Friday practice disruption due to rain, seemed to take Mercedes closer to the maximum of what the W14 has to offer, while others, including maybe Red Bull, were a little caught out. But one good performance in Australia, in specific, slightly cold conditions where tyre warm-up proved critical, does nothing to change the fact that Mercedes is ultimately not quick enough. Especially because it was still comfortably second best to Red Bull. Max Verstappen overcame a poor first lap that dropped him behind both Mercedes to score his second victory of the season. Though Russell was removed from contention after pitting during a safety car period that turned into an ill-timed red flag, Hamilton was still in front of Verstappen at the restart. But in Hamilton's words, Verstappen came sailing by with ease in the latest display of the straight-line speed advantage that Wolff called mind-boggling, and Max then routinely lapped significantly faster than his rivals whenever he felt he needed to build a gap. That's why Mercedes refuses to see this result as an argument that it should persevere with its chosen car concept after all. Russell was absolutely emphatic about this, stating that it's definitely still necessary to change, partly because the new direction being pursued is yielding good gains in the wind tunnel, and partly because Mercedes knows right now it can't beat Red Bull on merit. Russell fired a shot indirectly back at Alonso after the Australian GP, which he eventually retired from with a rare Mercedes engine failure. In his declaration that Mercedes' fight is with Red Bull, Russell said it did not matter if the team was faster than Ferrari or Aston Martin. That could be taken as a sign that while Mercedes' customer team has done a great job this year, Mercedes does not consider it a worthy rival. But while Mercedes is trying to get its act together, Aston Martin is a rival. And that means the prospect of more sites like Australia, where Hamilton and Alonso were in a straight fight for a top result. Their rivalry burned so brightly once upon a time that it seems pretty amazing we've barely seen an on-track battle between them in the last decade. There have been exceptions, like Alonso's stern defence of Hamilton in Hungary 2021 that was key to his Alpine teammate Esteban Ocon winning that race. But now we're seeing them fight for position in pretty equal machinery, and that's something to savour. Especially as Alonso is clearly enjoying being back at the front again in F1. He's no stranger to throwing grenades for his rivals to dodge. It's just been a while since he was in a car fast enough to make him really relevant to the main stories at the front of the field. But in the last week, he's taken aim at Mercedes. He made a dismissive comment suggesting he doubts his Aston Martin predecessor Sebastian Vettel will be doing as good a job as he is right now, and an interview emerged in which he said Hamilton's weaknesses are being exposed now he's not in F1's best car. These two have a burning desire to beat one another, but there's also a genuine underlying respect there. This was clear after the race in Melbourne, where they were full of praise for the job the other did in an intense race that never quite exploded into a full-on wheel-to-wheel battle. Alonso chased Hamilton for the whole Grand Prix, and the Aston Martin looked like the faster car, just not by enough to ever get close enough to launch an attack. The controversial late red flag maybe denied Alonso a chance to line up one last go, but even he was not convinced he really would have been able to get the job done. Unless something dramatic happens to change the pecking order in F1's 3-week gap before the next race in Azerbaijan, we should have plenty more chances to see these two go wheel-to-wheel again. And if you're wondering just how rare that's been of late, consider this. The Verstappen-Hamilton-Alonso podium in Australia was just the second time they have finished in the top 3 together. It shows just how marginalised Alonso has been in the second half of his F1 career, with Qatar 2021 his only podium between 2013 and this season. Now he finally has Mercedes in his sights again, on track and off it, and that should be anything but boring.